My wife froze when she saw me at the entrance to the company party. His eyes widened, the glass of champagne slipped a little in his fingers and a slight tremor ran through his body. She knew in that instant. I knew the carefully constructed lie was crumbling in front of everyone. He knew that his perfect world of secrets and betrayals was about to fall apart. And he knew that this was not just a casual meeting between husband and wife, but a public execution of their charade. I was there, standing still, watching her with the coldness of someone who already had all the proof, of someone who no longer felt anger, just an exhausting tiredness for everything I had endured up until that moment. But he was not alone. Beside me, my lawyer held a black leather briefcase. Inside, the divorce papers. A formal condemnation for the woman who had sworn to love me and, without any hesitation, betrayed me at the company's own party where I believed she would just celebrate another year of achievements. The irony was unbearable. But there was something worse. She was not alone. The man beside him wore a discreet, satisfied smile. A small gesture, but full of meaning. He was not afraid of being seen, because there was nothing to hide anymore. The betrayal wasn't recent, it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a night of error. It was something that had settled into my life, slowly, while I still believed in the love we shared. While I was making plans. While I believed in your loyalty. The impact of the truth was not a sudden explosion, but rather a silent, cruel and inevitable crash. Like an animal being slaughtered little by little, with no chance of defense. And the worst of all. I never suspected. Or at least not as it should be. There were signs, of course. Small changes, attitudes that would have seemed normal before, but that, when put together, screamed the truth that I refused to see. She started leaving work later, justifying it with last-minute meetings. She started to dress up more, change her perfume, buy new lingerie that, curiously, was not used with me. Small slips and excuses, phrases that didn't fit. But I was the husband who trusted, the one who believed that marriage had cycles and that things would soon return to normal. Nonsense. There was no turning back, because she had already crossed the line long before I realized it. The love that I thought existed was no more than a worn-out memory. And there she was, in front of me, next to the man I was cheating on, without the need to pretend anymore. But what she didn't know, what no one at that party knew, was that I had already found out everything weeks ago. I knew where they were, I knew what lame excuses she used, I even knew the times she sent him messages while she was sitting next to me on the couch, pretending to be just distracted by social media. I saw everything. I read everything. And the worst part? I knew this man. More than that. He had already been to our house. He had already shaken my hand. He had already looked me in the eyes and said my name with forced respect. The cynicism was nauseating. The truth was revealed to me in a brutal way. A forgotten message on her cell phone screen. Just a name and a time. Curious, naive perhaps, I tried to find out more. What started as a small question turned into a meticulous investigation. With each discovery, with each detail, I felt my world falling apart. The photos I found. Hotel reservations. The late-night calls. The way she laughed typing on the phone, while I thought it was just a conversation with a friend. Everything fit. Everything pointed to one inescapable fact: I was betrayed, deceived and ridiculed within my own marriage. And now I was there, at the height of irony. At the moment she believed she was safe, at the event where she most likely felt untouchable, surrounded by colleagues, bosses and friends, the final blow would be struck. She never imagined I would react like this. She never imagined that I would come there, with my head held high, ready to put her against the wall in front of everyone. She never imagined that I would deliver the divorce papers not in a private moment, where she could cry and beg, but there, in front of everything and everyone, where there would be no chance of disguise. Silence fell over the party as I approached. She stuttered something inaudible, her face paling as she understood what was coming. What are you doing here?" His voice shook. For the first time, there was no certainty in his words. For the first time, she was vulnerable. I smiled, a cold, controlled smile. The pain was no longer visible. What remained was the resolve of a man who knew the truth. A man who was about to turn a new page. "I think this night will be unforgettable for you," I replied, holding out the envelope. The silence became a suffocating weight in the environment. Some people looked away, embarrassed. Others couldn't hide their shock, whispering among themselves. And then, when she took the envelope with shaking hands and opened it, I saw it. I saw the mask crumble. The horror in her eyes, the realization of what was happening. From what I knew. Of what would come next. And that's when I realized. This was just the beginning. The betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just a wrong choice. It was something much bigger. Something that had been happening for much longer than I imagined. Because, contrary to what I thought, this man beside her wasn't just a recent fling. It wasn't just a passing fling. He had been part of our life for years. More than I could have ever imagined. But what surprised me most wasn't that. It wasn't the fact that I had been deceived for so long. The real blow was realizing that, in fact, I may never have met the woman I married. Because, by investigating deeper, I discovered secrets that she would never confess. I discovered things she tried to bury. And when the whole truth finally came out, I understood that this betrayal was just one part of the puzzle. I was about to find out that my wife was a woman I had never really met. And that was what terrified me the most. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be romanticized or justified. Our stories are fictional, but the pain, disappointment and consequences are real. The objective is one, to show how infidelity can destroy lives, relationships and even the cheater himself. Betrayal is never worth it. Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear is shocking, intense, and impossible to ignore. The truth always comes out, and today, you'll see how. From the moment they met, David and Laura seemed destined for each other. Everything between them happened naturally, as if they were two pieces of a puzzle that fit together perfectly. He is a determined businessman, someone who learned the weight of responsibility from an early age, always carrying on his shoulders the duty to take care of his own life and build something solid for the future. She was a charming woman, with an easy smile and a striking presence, someone who knew how to light up a room with just her look. When they got married, the promise of lasting love seemed unbreakable. David saw nothing but Laura, and Laura, at least at first, seemed to feel the same way. They shared dreams, made plans and built a life that, to anyone on the outside, was admirable. A perfect couple, one of those who served as an example in social circles, who attracted looks of admiration and even a certain amount of envy. But what time has shown is that perfection is never more than an illusion. David has always been a man who believed in hard work. Since he was young, he fought to conquer each of the steps he climbed, without shortcuts, without privileges. He learned that nothing came for free in life and that if he wanted to provide comfort and stability for his wife, he would need to try his hardest. And that's exactly what he did. While others took advantage of the weekends to rest, he used this time to improve himself. If it was necessary to travel for work, he would go. If it was necessary to spend sleepless nights to deliver a project, he would deliver. All because he believed that in the end it would be worth it, that the stability he was building would benefit not only him, but mainly Laura. She, on the other hand, has always had a freer spirit. I liked being surrounded by people, being recognized, being the center of attention. Marriage, at first, didn't seem to suffocate her. On the contrary, David was always a man who allowed her to shine, who encouraged her to pursue what she wanted. But over time, their interests began to take different directions. While he delved deeper into the corporate world, she delved deeper into social life. David's business dinners became more frequent, meetings were longer and travel became part of his routine. For him, it was a price to pay for a comfortable future. For Laura, it was loneliness. She never said it openly, but small actions began to show her dissatisfaction. At first, there were subtle comments about the lack of time together, then came complaints about the constant absences. David always responded that he was doing it for them, for their marriage, for the life they wanted to have. And in a way, it was true. He did not see himself as a negligent husband, quite the opposite. For him, taking care of his wife also meant making sure she never had to worry about anything. But Laura's priorities seemed to be different. She wanted more than just financial security. I wanted emotion, I wanted to feel that I was still desired, that I was still the woman who could win eyes, who could arouse passions. Over time, she stopped insisting on arguments and began to occupy herself in other ways. He found his escape valve in his career, and in socializing with friends he found compensation for moments of loneliness. The house that was once a refuge for the two began to become just a place of passage. David, always racing against time, trying to keep up with all his responsibilities, and Laura, filling the empty spaces in her life with events, dinners and social gatherings. What was once a marriage full of conversations and laughter, became a silent relationship, where words were measured and interactions were limited to basic everyday issues. It wasn't a fight, it wasn't hostility, it was something much worse. It was the indifference that grew between the two without them realizing it. The nights when they lay in the same bed, but each lost in their own thoughts, without the need to share their concerns, became more and more frequent. David still believed in marriage. For him, difficult times were normal, something every couple faced. But despite his faith in the relationship, an uncomfortable feeling began to grow within him. Small details that didn't catch his attention before started to make him restless. Laura's schedule has changed. Their appointments became more frequent, and when they were together, the feeling of distance was almost palpable. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it was just a natural reflection of the busy routine they had. But deep down, something bothered him. An intuition he couldn't explain, a feeling that something was beyond his control. Laura, on the other hand, was living a completely different reality. For her, life needed more. He needed intensity, he needed something that Davi, at that moment, seemed incapable of providing. The predictable routine of marriage suffocated her in ways she never imagined. She looked at him and saw a man who worked tirelessly, but who no longer saw her with the same eyes as before. She didn't know if it was his fault, her fault, or just the time that had passed. But something inside her screamed for change. And it was like that, without much planning, without even realizing where it would take her, that she began to allow herself things that, years ago, she would never have imagined. If before guilt would prevent her from taking certain actions, now it seemed like just a detail. Little lies became part of the routine, easy justifications that hid truths that she preferred not to face. The problem is, once you start down a path like this, there's rarely any turning back. At first, it was just harmless flirting, moments where she allowed herself to feel that she was still desired, that she could still spark interest. But that soon became insufficient. When he realized, he was already stepping into territories he never imagined he would cross. The sense of danger, the risk, the secrecy, all of it made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. And then, when she least expected it, she found herself involved in something much bigger than she could control. David didn't know. He still believed in the woman he had by his side, he still saw her as the person with whom he built his life. But what he didn't imagine was that the marriage he tried so hard to preserve was no longer the same. What he thought was just a difficult phase was actually a chasm growing between them, a chasm that Laura had already crossed. But he still didn't know. And for now, she insisted on keeping it that way. The weeks passed and the routine between David and Laura followed an increasingly predictable course. Interactions between them were measured, dialogues limited to practical everyday issues. David continued to dedicate himself to his work, convinced that the effort was worth it, believing that, at some point, things would go back to the way they were before. He still loved Laura, even if he didn't express it like he did at first. I thought that concrete gestures, such as guaranteeing a comfortable life and a secure future, were sufficient demonstrations. But love doesn't survive on stability alone. He didn't see, or perhaps he refused to see, that the woman next to him no longer looked at him in the same way. There was an invisible distance growing between the two, a silent space filled by everything that was unsaid, by everything that was avoided. Laura felt increasingly restless. The days passed without much change, and the feeling of being trapped in a monotonous existence gnawed at her. At first, he tried to ignore this discomfort, convincing himself that it was just a phase. But, over time, he began to look for ways to fill that void. Little moments of escape, innocent distractions, conversations that seemed harmless but that, little by little, became something more. She found herself drawn to something she couldn't name, a need to feel again what seemed to have been lost over the years. And it was exactly in this space of doubt that a new presence emerged in his life. He was someone who had been orbiting your social circle for some time. A confident, charismatic man who had a natural way of making people feel special. Laura didn't immediately realize the line she was crossing. At first, it was just occasional conversations, exchanges of glances that carried something subtly different, but that she ignored. Over time, the conversations became more frequent, the messages more constant, until his presence began to occupy spaces that previously belonged to David. There was something about that game of seduction that made her feel alive, desired, like she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't help it. Little by little, the idea of being close to him stopped being just a thought and became a real desire, something she longed for in a way she would never admit to herself. David, on the other hand, began to notice small changes. The nights when Laura came back later, the messages that seemed to steal her attention even when they were together. Small gestures that previously went unnoticed began to paint a picture that he didn't want to see. He wondered if he was being paranoid, if it wasn't just a reflection of accumulated fatigue. But something inside him insisted there was more than met the eye. The intuition was a silent warning that he tried to ignore, clinging to the idea that Laura would never do anything to betray him. Laura and her lover's game intensified. At first, they were just casual encounters, moments stolen from the routine. But the adrenaline of transgression was addictive. Each encounter brought a new risk, a new secret to hide. The excuses became more elaborate, the schedules increasingly adjusted to ensure David didn't get suspicious. She convinced herself that it meant nothing, that it was just a temporary escape, something that wouldn't put her real life at risk. But the truth was that the involvement had already surpassed any limit that could be considered temporary. His presence was an addiction, an uncontrollable desire that dragged her into dangerous territory. David, little by little, began to realize that something was wrong. It wasn't just a vague impression, but a series of small pieces of evidence that, when added together, formed a truth that he refused to accept. The smell of a perfume that wasn't hers permeated her clothes, messages that were frequently deleted, apologies that seemed rehearsed. He tried to rationalize, telling himself that he was exaggerating, that there was no real reason to be suspicious. But the doubt was there, eating away at his peace. Until one day, something broke his resistance. It was an ordinary night, like so many others. Laura said she was having dinner with friends and would be back late. David didn't question it. But, out of an impulse that he himself couldn't explain, he decided he needed to know more. He took the car and drove without a clear destination, just following the instinct that guided him. He didn't want to be that man, he didn't want to be someone who distrusts his own wife. But at the same time, something inside him screamed that the truth was closer than he imagined. When he stopped the car in front of the restaurant where Laura was supposed to be, the shock was immediate. Across the street, in the soft ambient light, she was there. But he wasn't with friends. I was with him. The man David knew, someone who had once visited his house, who had once shaken his hand, who had once smiled at him with false cordiality. Betrayal was not a sudden blow, but a process that unfolded before his eyes in slow motion. The way Laura looked at him, the casual touch that lingered a little longer than it should have, the way their expressions changed when they were together. There were no more doubts. He didn't need to hear anything, he didn't need concrete proof. The truth was there, explicit, undeniable. David didn't know how long he stood there, watching. His body was tense, his fists clenched, but his mind was strangely calm. There was no more room for illusion, for justifications. For the first time, he saw everything clearly. The marriage he believed was just going through a rough patch was long dead. He just hadn't realized it. And Laura, the woman he loved for so many years, was no longer the same. Or maybe it never had been. He didn't enter the restaurant. There was no scandal. He just walked away, feeling an emptiness that couldn't be filled. Betrayal was not just an isolated act. It was a reflection of everything that had been lost over the years, a cruel reminder that sometimes love isn't enough. But what he still didn't know was that this betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg. There was something much bigger hidden behind all that. Something that would change his life in ways he could never imagine. David spent the next few days in a state of emotional numbness, as if he were living in a world that was no longer his own. Laura's betrayal was a truth that he could no longer deny, and yet, every detail of that night continued to echo in his mind. He didn't confront Laura right away. I didn't want screaming, I didn't want fake tears, I didn't want empty apologies. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand how it all started and, above all, where it was going. But there was something he didn't yet know, something that was about to turn the shock of betrayal into something much worse. He decided it wasn't enough to just walk away. I needed concrete proof. Not to convince himself, he already knew the truth, but so that there would be no chance of manipulation when the time came for confrontation. He hired a private investigator, someone who could provide him with indisputable facts. And it was then that he realized that the betrayal was not recent. This wasn't about a few months of slip-ups, but about something much deeper, rooted in the past in a way he could never imagine. The researcher delivered a detailed dossier, meeting records, recovered messages, hotel reservations. But what really destroyed him wasn't the physical evidence. It was a specific detail, a piece of information that made his blood run cold and his stomach turn. The man Laura was cheating on him with wasn't just someone who appeared suddenly. He had been present in their lives for a long time. More than that. He played a role that David could never have suspected. When looking at the dates recorded in the documents, David noticed something that didn't make sense. The relationship between Laura and that man hadn't started for months or even a year. He had started before the wedding. Even before he and Laura built a life together. They had never finished. It had all been a farce. She was with David not for love, but for convenience, for stability, for everything he represented. And that other man, he was always there, in the shadows, waiting, taking advantage of the moments when David was too busy to notice. David's stomach turned as a specific memory surfaced in his mind. The day Laura told us she was pregnant. The day he believed his life was about to change forever, that a new chapter was beginning. He remembered the emotion, the fear, the joy. And now, looking at that evidence, something inside him screamed in denial. It couldn't be. But the logic was cruel. The time didn't add up. The messages indicated frequent meetings before, during, and after that time. The only possible conclusion made the ground disappear beneath his feet. His son, maybe he wasn't his son. David's hands shook as he held the evidence. A growing urgency came over him, a desperate need to confront her, to get the truth he feared from her. There was no more time to rationalize. He left the house, drove without thinking, feeling his heart beating irregularly. When he got home, he found Laura calm, as if nothing was happening, as if their lives were still intact. But something changed the moment their eyes met. Laura noticed. She felt the storm approaching, but still didn't know how devastating it would be. The room became a silent battlefield. David threw the papers on the table, watching her as she picked up the dossier with shaking hands. He didn't say anything right away. "I wanted to see your reaction. I wanted to see if she would have the courage to continue lying." But Laura remained silent for too long. The expression on his face said it all. There was guilt, but there was also something deeper, something that resembled fear. David finally broke the silence. His voice was more controlled than he imagined, but each word was like a sharp blade. He asked since when. He asked why. She asked what he meant to her. And Laura hesitated. She tried to argue that it wasn't as it seemed, that things had gotten complicated, that she never wanted to hurt him. But every word was an insult. Then, he asked the question she hadn't expected. He asked about their son. He asked if the boy was really his. Laura's expression instantly changed. It was as if the impact of the question had hit her physically. She tried to deny it, tried to keep up the charade, but there was something in her posture, in the way she looked away, that told her the truth before she could even utter any words. David felt the weight of the world come crashing down on him. All those years. All those memories. All built on a lie. He didn't know which was worse, the betrayal itself or the fact that his entire life had been manipulated. Laura finally gave in. She said she didn't know, that she never wanted to know, that she chose to believe David was the father because he was always there, because he was always a perfect husband, a good man. But that wasn't enough. Doubt was now a living entity within him, eating away at everything he had left. And he knew he couldn't live with that uncertainty. He demanded a DNA test. And Laura had no choice but to agree. The silence between them was unbearable as they waited for the results. David could no longer look at her without feeling a mixture of hatred and despair. He loved that boy. He raised him, protected him, taught him everything he knew. But now, everything was tainted with doubt. When the result finally arrived, there was no more room for hope. The confirmation was there, in black and white. The boy was not his son. The impact was devastating. David felt as if his own heart had been ripped out of his chest. He didn't scream, he didn't break anything, he didn't lose control. He just turned and left. Because there was nothing more to be said. Because everything he knew, everything he believed in, had been destroyed in a way that could never be repaired. David walked out of the house aimlessly, the air thin around him, as if the entire world was collapsing on his shoulders. His steps were heavy, his breathing erratic, and with each beat of his heart, the pain inside his chest seemed to grow unbearable. The DNA test result still burned in his hands, a piece of paper that turned his entire life into a lie. Every memory built, every moment he held that boy in his arms, taught him to walk, to talk, to see the world, all based on a cruel mistake, on a betrayal so profound that it bordered on the unthinkable. He wanted to scream, he wanted to destroy everything around him, but he didn't have enough strength for that. The shock was too great. The weight of the truth crushed him. He walked without direction for a time that he didn't know how to measure. The streets were busy, people went about their routines as if nothing had changed, as if the world was still the same. But to him, nothing made sense anymore. He didn't know how to go home, didn't know how to look at Laura again without feeling contempt, without feeling the bitter taste of betrayal poisoning every memory he once held sacred. How could she allow this to happen? How could he have lived by her side for years, looking into her eyes, sharing her bed, creating a life together, knowing it was all a farce? And more than that, how could you make him love a son who might never have been yours? The cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He knew it was Laura. He knew she would try to explain, apologize, maybe even beg him not to make impulsive decisions. But nothing she said could erase the facts. He ignored the call, then the second, the third. I knew that at some point I would have to face her, but not now. Now all I wanted was to run away. He stopped at an unfamiliar bar, one of those small, discreet ones, where no one asks questions, where no one cares about who you are or what you're going through. He sat down in a corner, ordered a double whiskey and drank it in one gulp. The alcohol burned down his throat, but it wasn't enough to numb the pain that was throbbing inside him. He asked for another, then another. Still, reality was still there, firm, unshakable, cruel. He was trying to escape something from which there was no escape. So finally, when the fourth call came, he answered. Not because I wanted to listen to Laura, but because I knew I needed to. The silence on the other side was short, and then her voice came, filled with despair. She was crying, begging, saying she needed to see him, that she needed to talk to him. He was silent for a few seconds, listening to her crying, feeling something between anger and exhaustion. So I said just one thing, that I would be home when he got back. He hung up before she could say anything else. When he returned, he found Laura sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen, her face streaked with tears. But he felt no compassion. I felt an emptiness. He felt like a stranger in his own home. He stopped at the door, crossed his arms and waited. I didn't want softness, I didn't want empty excuses. I wanted truths. And this time, I wouldn't accept anything less than that. Laura stood up slowly, hesitantly, trying to find words that could fix what was impossible to fix. She tried to explain that she never wanted to hurt him, that she never planned for things to come to this. She said that when she got pregnant, she was confused, that she believed David was the father, that she always wanted to believe that because he was the right man, the perfect husband, the only one who could give her the life she wanted. But he didn't want justifications. He wanted to know why she allowed him to live a lie for years. Because you never told the truth. Why did you continue by his side, pretending, lying, deceiving? She cried, said she was afraid. Scared of losing him, scared of admitting to herself that she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But he didn't want to hear about her fear anymore. He wanted to know about what would happen now. The boy, the one he raised as his son, how could he continue to look at him the same way? How could he carry this weight without it completely destroying him? Laura begged him not to give up everything. He said that despite everything, they could still find a way. But David didn't see how. How do you go back to something that was never real? How do you rebuild a marriage that was built on such a profound lie? He looked at her, trying to find traces of the woman he once loved, but all he saw was someone he no longer recognized. Was the love still there? Maybe he was, but now he was torn, fragmented, covered in the pain of betrayal. He didn't respond. He just left the room, went up the stairs, picked up a suitcase and started packing his things. Laura ran after him, pleading, saying that they needed to talk, that he couldn't just leave. But he could. And he would. Because, at that moment, staying was the same as condemning yourself to a suffocating existence. He didn't want hate. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted distance. Before leaving, he looked at Laura one last time. He said he didn't know what he would do, that he needed time to think. But one thing was certain, he could no longer share the same house with her. And then, he left. The road ahead was an uncertain path, full of unanswered questions. He didn't know where he was going, he didn't know what he would do with everything he discovered. But one thing was certain, it would never be the same again. And what came next, he still had to find out. David drove aimlessly, without thinking, just letting the road stretch out in front of him as his mind oscillated between torpor and revolt. The steering wheel seemed to be the only thing he still controlled, the only reality that didn't crumble in his hands. With each kilometer traveled, memories imposed themselves on his mind, scenes from a lifetime built on a false foundation, moments that once carried meaning and were now just fragments of an illusion. The boy running towards him after a hard day at work, jumping into his arms, calling him dad, laughing, trusting him. How did you get rid of it? How did he disconnect from the bond that, even though it wasn't blood, had been real for him? The truth crushed him inside, but there was something worse, the uncertainty of what would come next. His cell phone vibrated on the passenger seat, but he didn't need to look to know who it belonged to. Laura would tirelessly try to get him back, using every word that could create some hesitation in her decision. But what she didn't understand, or pretended not to understand, was that there was no going back. Nothing she said would erase the fact that she lived alongside him, hiding the truth, manipulating him, letting him raise a child that wasn't his without even giving him the chance to choose if he wanted to stay in that lie. He wanted to believe that, at some point, she had felt guilt, that her hesitation over the years was a reflection of regret. But did repentance really mean anything when a person chose, day after day, to continue the charade? He stopped the car in front of a cheap motel on the road. He didn't want to go home, he didn't want to hold himself up in a luxurious hotel, where the silence of the hallways would remind him of the emptiness he now felt. He just wanted a space where he could close his eyes without Laura being around, without the weight of the past crushing him once and for all. As soon as he entered the simple room, he threw himself on the bed without bothering to take off his shoes. The white ceiling became a mirror of his confused mind, and for a moment he tried not to think about anything. He tried to hold on to the only thing that still felt real: he was free. But freedom has a price. And that price was losing everything he believed to be true. Sleep came restlessly, filled with dreams that were nothing more than memories mixed with the despair of discovery. He saw the little boy holding his hand on the first day of school, he saw Laura looking at him at the altar on his wedding day, he saw the shadow of another man always present, lurking, as if it had been there the whole time without him noticing. And when he woke up, emptiness filled him like a punch in the stomach. He got up slowly, looked at the clock and realized he had only slept a few hours. But it didn't matter. The next day would not bring any easier answers. The only thing he knew was that he couldn't run away forever. There was something that still needed to be done. He drove back to the city without rushing, as if each kilometer postponed was an extra breath before the inevitable. He needed to see the boy. I didn't know what I would say, I didn't know if I would have the strength to look at him without feeling the bitter taste of disappointment. But it couldn't just disappear. It wasn't his fault. And as much as David was destroyed, he couldn't imagine causing irreversible pain to a child who hadn't chosen to be in the middle of that storm. When he arrived at the house of a close friend, someone he trusted enough to ask for shelter, he sent a message to Laura. Direct. He said he wanted to see the boy. I didn't want arguments, I didn't want explanations. Just a date. The phone vibrated a few minutes later, and for the first time, he answered. Her voice was filled with hesitation, contained relief mixed with fear that anything said could drive him away for good. He asked where he was, if he was okay, if he had eaten. But he didn't want her worry, didn't want anything that sounded like a semblance of normalcy. He just said that he would go to the house that night and that he hoped the boy would be there. The silence on the other end was long enough for him to feel the tension running through the phone line. And so, she agreed. He said he would wait for him. Night fell slowly and suffocatingly. When David stopped the car in front of the house he once called home, he felt nausea rise in his throat. He took a deep breath before leaving. He walked to the door with the feeling that his feet weighed more than they should have. When it opened, Laura was there, her face downcast, but not daring to try to touch him or say anything beyond a murmur of greeting. He didn't respond. His eyes swept the house, looking for the boy. And then, there he was, sitting on the couch, holding a toy in his hands, his eyes wide, confused. David felt a tightness in his chest. The child smiled when he saw him. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms as she always did. And it was at that moment that David realized something even more devastating than the betrayal, than the lie. He loved him. Regardless of blood, regardless of everything. The boy didn't know anything about what was happening, he didn't understand the complexities of the adult world. To him, David was still his father. It was still his safe haven. And at that moment, David asked himself, could he give this up? Could you rip that bond away from yourself and pretend that nothing else mattered? Laura watched everything from afar, with a look that mixed anguish and hope. She knew this was the decisive moment. David held the boy for a longer time than usual, as if he was trying to absorb what was left of a life that no longer existed. And then, she bent down to his level, looked into his eyes and smiled. But it was a different smile. A smile that said something was about to change. Laura held her breath as she watched the scene. David didn't know what he would say next. But he knew that night would not end without a definitive decision. The only question was, were you ready to accept what that meant? Were you ready to say goodbye to everything you knew? Or was there something inside him that could still save him from the abyss into which he had been thrown? David remained kneeling, watching the boy in front of him, feeling the weight of a decision he never thought he would have to make. The boy, still innocent of the chaos that the adults had created, looked at him with the same confidence as always, without any idea of what was about to happen. The truth was that, regardless of blood, that boy was part of him. Not because of genetic ties, but because of the years of coexistence, for the nights when he calmed him down after a nightmare, for the spontaneous hugs, for the moments when he was called father with all the purity that a child could express. But what now? What would happen when he turned his back? When did the truths that adults hid begin to overflow? Laura was leaning against the door, her arms crossed defensively, as if preparing for the final sentence. His eyes were puffy, but there was something more than guilt in them. There was fear. Not because of the marriage that was already destroyed, but because of what would come next. For the real possibility that David would disappear from their lives forever, taking with him any trace of love that once existed. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. Then he took a deep breath and tried again, with a hesitation that made his words fragile. She said he could hate her for the rest of his life, but that the boy wasn't to blame for anything. That he still needed him. That I wouldn't understand if, from one moment to the next, David simply disappeared. He felt the anger rise. How did she have the courage to ask that? How dare she try to keep him in that place, as if he should ignore everything that had been done? The betrayal, the lie, the stolen years. He wanted to scream, he wanted to say that he didn't owe anyone anything, that it wasn't his obligation to stay. But then he looked at the boy again, still holding his hand tightly, as if he somehow knew something was wrong but couldn't explain what. David closed his eyes for a second and took a deep breath. It wasn't about Laura. It wasn't about revenge. It was about a kid who, no matter what, still saw him as a hero. But there was another question: what if he stayed? What would that mean? Would he be condemning himself to a future in which he would have to face Laura every day, knowing that her every word was filled with the past and lies? Could I live like this, as if everything could be reconstructed somehow? The answer came quickly and cruelly. No. He couldn't. But it also couldn't just disappear. He let out a long sigh and passed his hand over his face, feeling tiredness consuming every part of his body. Then, finally, he looked at Laura with an expression that no longer carried hate, nor love, nor any trace of feeling that she could use against him. He said he needed time, that he didn't know what to do yet, but that he wouldn't make any hasty decisions. That, for now, she wanted to remain in the boy's life, but not in their house, not by her side. Laura's reaction was a mix of relief and frustration. She knew she couldn't ask for more than that, but she also knew she had no control over what would happen next. The boy looked at the two, feeling that something was wrong, but not understanding the depth of the situation. He asked if David was going to sleep there, if he would stay for dinner. The innocence in the question made his throat tighten. I said no, but I would come back to see him. The boy pouted in disappointment, but nodded, trusting the words that had always been true to him. David knew that this time the promise was uncertain territory. He left the house without looking back. Every step he took felt like a definitive departure from everything he knew. He drove for a long time before stopping at a park where he used to take the boy when he was younger. He sat on a bench and stared into space, lost in his own thoughts. That's when he realized he didn't know who he was anymore. For years, his identity was built around family, around the idea of being a husband, a father, a provider. But now it was all a farce undone. He needed to discover who he was without Laura, without the weight of a broken marriage, without the certainty that what he built was really his. Time passed, and the following weeks were a painful process of deconstruction. He moved to a temporary apartment, began to establish a routine away from the house he shared with Laura, but maintained contact with the boy. At first, the visits were full of tension. Laura avoided talking much, and David limited himself to interacting with the boy without getting into conflicts. But one thing was clear, he couldn't just cut ties. There was still something there, something that couldn't be erased so easily. In one of the meetings, when they were in a cafe, the boy held his hand tightly and asked, with eyes full of insecurity, if he was still his father. The question was like a punch in the gut. David was silent for a few moments, feeling the real weight of that conversation. Then she smiled and ruffled his hair, saying that it would always be. It didn't matter what happened. The boy smiled back, and in that moment, something inside David found a small piece of peace. But Laura didn't give up. He tried to get closer in a subtle way, leaving messages, trying to transform casual encounters into something that could open a door to the past. But he didn't want the past. He wanted something new, something that wasn't tainted by the lies and shadows of a love that was never real. And it was just when he decided he was ready to move on that something unexpected happened. One night, while leaving a professional event, he met a woman. Not in the dramatic or intense way you see in movies, but in a simple, natural way. A casual conversation that went on longer than he expected, a smile that brought a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. It was light, it was new, it was true. For the first time since everything happened, he felt like maybe there was a way beyond the pain, beyond the betrayal. Maybe he wouldn't have to carry that story forever, maybe he could, one day, look back without feeling like his life was a mistake. As he drove home that night, he realized that despite everything, he was breathing easier. And that, for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so scary. There were choices to be made, there were ties that could never be severed, but there was also something more. There was a chance to start over. And that, at that moment, was all he needed. Time passed, and David realized that the pain of betrayal was not completely erased, but was being transformed. At first, it was like a poison running through his veins, destroying everything around him, making it impossible to see any possibility of a future. But over the days, the weeks, the months, the anger dissipated, giving way to something different. Acceptance. Not from the lie, not from what happened, but from the reality that he could never change the past. The only choice he had left was what he would do with his future. He didn't want to be a bitter man, he didn't want to carry hatred with him. He wanted something real, he wanted peace. And for the first time, he understood that the only way to achieve this was to let go of everything he once believed to be unbreakable. He looked at Laura no longer with anger, but with an overwhelming indifference, the one that kills any hope of reconciliation. There was nothing else there. She tried, she insisted, she tried to show that they could still fix what was broken, but her every attempt was met with absolute silence. He didn't need to say anything. The void between them spoke for itself. Divorce was inevitable. Laura signed the papers with tears in her eyes, perhaps still clinging to the idea that she could convince him to change his mind. But David was already far from there, in spirit, in mind, in heart. What existed between them had died long before the betrayal came to light. The only thing that still connected them was the boy. And that was the only battle he was still willing to fight. Custody was not a legal issue. Laura knew that David would never try to take her away from her son, and he knew that he couldn't abandon someone who, regardless of everything, still saw him as a father. But the dynamic has changed. He was no longer present all the time, he didn't share the same spaces, he didn't pretend that everything was fine. He became a father from a distance, present at specific moments, but without the same constancy as before. That was the hardest. Knowing that there was an invisible line between him and the boy, a line that should never have existed but was now impossible to ignore. Laura, on the other hand, had to face the consequences of her own actions. After David left, after the marriage fell apart and the reality of her choice finally fell on her shoulders, she realized the weight of the destruction she had caused. The man who destroyed her marriage the one who was there for so many years, disappeared when everything came to light. He didn't want commitment, he didn't want to be by her side when the stability she valued so much crumbled. He wanted what he always had, the game, the risk, the adrenaline. When that was gone, he was gone too. And Laura found herself alone. He tried to rebuild his life, tried to believe he could move on, but regret was a persistent shadow. She lost her husband who never let her lack for anything, she lost the man who was by her side for years, she lost the security she sought so much. And worse than that, she lost his respect, the one thing she could never get back. David moved on. Not in the way movies romanticize, not with an easy solution, not with a perfect ending. But in the real way. He learned to live with what happened, he learned that not all questions need answers, he learned that some pains don't disappear, but become part of his story. He met new people, opened himself up to new possibilities, but without rushing, without the urgency to fill the void with anything that seemed like comfort. He wanted something genuine, something that didn't need to be built on doubt or lies. And one day, without even looking, he found someone. A woman who had no connection with her past, who did not know her history, who did not carry the marks of betrayal. She was different from Laura. Not perfect, not an antidote to pain, but real. And that was enough. The boy grew up knowing that David was not his biological father, but he never questioned the bond they had. He knew the truth could have driven them both away, but David stayed. He was there for birthdays, for difficult times, for advice about life. He wasn't the father by blood, but he was the father who chose to stay, and in the end, that was what really mattered. The bond between them survived the lie, the pain, the separation. Because true love doesn't need genetics. It needs presence, it needs choice. And David chose. Time has taught him that betrayal destroys, that lies corrode, that love can be manipulated. But he also taught that no one needs to be defined by that. He was not a betrayed man. He was a man who survived. And now, he was a man who knew that his future would not be written by the scars of the past, but by the choices he made from then on. And he chose to live. He chose to follow. He chose to start over. If you've made it this far, I want to know your opinion on this story. What would you do in David's place? Could you forgive? Leave your comment, I want to know what you think. And if you like this type of story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Remember, betrayal is never worth it, and consequences always follow. See you in the next story.